To introduce tonight's keynote speaker, John Nosta. John is one of the top thinkers in healthcare and one of the most admired thought leaders in the digital health revolution. He's the founder of Nosta Lab and a member of the Google Health Advisory Board. John is definitely, as you're about to see, has a unique combination as a strategic thinker, marketer, and entrepreneur. His previous roles as Chief Creative Officer and Chief Strategic Officer at Ogilvy Common Health, and also a writer for Forbes Health Critical, cements his role as a leading thinker in the digital health revolution. Please join me in welcoming John Nosta.
So good evening, everybody. So it's about 9 o'clock. You've all had a full day. You have a full stomach. You have a complete redistribution of blood volume to your gut. So I'm a little concerned that I can keep everybody alert and attentive to the talk. I want to just spend 45 minutes or so, maybe an hour, and talk about this whole notion of digital health from a bit of a functional, practical, and philosophical perspective today. So I want to have some fun. If we want to have questions, if you think something pops up, just raise your hand. I'd like it to make it a little bit more fun, a little bit more iterative, just because of where we are, the time, and a fairly small group. And I'm probably going to walk around. So I run a little think tank that looks at this dynamic, what's going on in technology, and how do we best put that into perspective. It's a really interesting point in time in the universe. And there are a few key things that I'd like to share with you. I'd like you to kind of feel empowered about. And the first one is that today is a very special and interesting time in human history. People often talk about things like the Gutenberg moment as being this fundamental transition point in human history. As a guy who works with Google, it's kind of interesting because the Gutenberg press basically allowed us to take information and disseminate it. And in a very interesting way, that's similar to what the web has done. But I don't think that's the name of the game here today. I don't think it's about a Gutenberg moment. In fact, I think it's a lot bigger. That's why I think the key takeaway here is that we're all very lucky to be alive now. And I want to discuss this in the context of what I call a techno-optimist, because I know that there's issues around compliance, cybersecurity, HIPAA, all that kind of stuff. And I don't want to get weighed down in that. It's a very, very important discussion. But I think today, the postprandial, full-belly, couple cocktail discussion should be a little bit more optimistic and not so dour, if you don't mind. So I'll try to kind of do it that way. I want to introduce a concept that I recently kind of stumbled over. I made it up. And it's this idea of IQ and EQ. Now, we all know what IQ is. I think it's a very important clinical determinant. If we have kids, you want your kids to be smart. You want them to have a good IQ because living in the cognitive world is important. But there's also this notion of EQ. Now, EQ is our emotional quotient. So I want my kids growing up to be smart, but I also want them to be empathic. I want them to have a sense of humanity. And that's an important distinction. But what I'm finding today, and this is a brand new term, I wrote about this in my blog in Psychology today, is the notion of TQ, the notion of a technology quotient. I just want to share that as sort of something that's sort of on people's radar that they're talking about. And it's a simple idea. The idea is our ability to assimilate technology into our lives will become a functional determinant of our success. Think about that for a minute. When your kids are in school, you want them to assimilate knowledge. You want them to assimilate this emotional connectivity with people. But our ability to grasp, understand, and assimilate technology is really becoming important. I'm seeing this all over the place. Now, whether it's a student in school, whether it's a marketer being able to use SEO, search engine optimization, in a marketing plan, or even a clinician. And when I speak with medical students, I'm finding today that they find technology, and these are to the medical students today, they find technology as the savior to the profession. Interestingly, if you talk to a 50-year-old physician today, he or she might tell you that technology is the curse of the profession in many interesting ways. So I'm going to throw that out as something new, something I'm working on, but it's this notion of your technological quotient. Your ability to assimilate information and technology is, in part, a determinant to your success. So when I talk about digital health, I don't talk about activity trackers. How many people here are wearing an activity tracker now? 1, 2, 5, not okay, a pretty good amount. I have my activity, I don't call it activity tracker, I actually call it a dust collector. I have a whole stack of them on my bedroom there. I failed to charge them. But I don't want that to define digital health today. I don't want you to think about activity trackers in the context that they currently exist, because while they are important, I'll tell you the simple and principal role of an activity tracker today. It's allowing people who are fit to woo partners. That's what it is. It's the guys at the gym who are buff, who have their 12,000 steps, the heck with 10,000 steps. It's a badge of honor. People are wearing it on their ankle now sometimes. But I don't see the 65-year-old man with metabolic syndrome reaching out and grabbing that activity tracker as a panacea to wellness. It's not happening. In fact, it's antithetical to what's going on. And the reason is that when we look at these activity trackers, they are an athletic option. And we have to shift them to a clinical imperative. That's the fundamental dynamic that we need to do. And I'm going to go through some examples about how we can maybe do that. I'll give you one example just off the bat, since I'm walking, is that steps are great. But what about using that same 3D accelerometer that is just as cheap and just as easy to acquire a signal and measure gait, tremor, and look at it in the context of movement disorders to optimize therapy for patients with Parkinson syndrome? See what we just did? We took an activity tracker and we changed the game. We made it into a movement disorder sensor to optimize therapy in Parkinson's disease. What do? We moved it from an athletic option, from the jock in the gym, to the guy on the couch. So these are kind of the things that I think about and I try to study and put into context. Let me go back real quick. But when I talk about digital health today, this is a slide that's a year old. It came out of Singularity University, a great meeting out in San Diego. But when you look at what's going on in Singularity, the words are artificial intelligence, big data, machine learning, neuromedicine, AR, VR, medical education. So when we think of the technological application in health, it's much broader than what a lot of people's sort of initial perspective. I talked to a brand team about a digital health initiative, and what do they think of? Build an app, right? Something like that. It's not unimportant, but when I look at digital health, when I look at the next 3 to 5 years, I see amazing changes that are occurring. So I just want to put that on people's radar. Now, here's where we are now. And I started my talk a little bit about this and saying that it's a great time to be alive. I don't mean that lightly. I really, really mean that seriously. I've studied this extensively and talked with a lot of really, really interesting people about this. And we are at a profound inflection point in human history. The game is changing. And it's changing from a host of perspectives, and this sort of captures it in a bit of a cartoon. But if you want to kind of build it in, if you want to take the spots and talk with our famous Gutenberg printing press that's way on the end over here, and we look at the evolution of things, we're seeing amazing applications of technology. In fact, one of them is really the fundamental game changer. When this thing happens, and it's actually happening now, it's going to be the central disruptive reality that's going to change our lives. Anybody want to guess? I heard something in the back. Yes, sir? You're exactly right. That was great. That was good. I'm going to kind of put it in a little bit of social context, but I think that the evolution of the car is going to change things the way something else did a few years ago, and I'm going to try to bring that into comparison to talk about it. Accelerated growth, everyone knows about Moore's law, processing speed, doubling every 12 to 16 months. My favorite sort of joke is EROM's law, or E-Room's law, I guess with the way you pronounce it. It's Moore's law backwards, and that's the accelerating cost of drug development. So everybody always kind of chuckles about it, but it's sad, because when we look at these exponential changes, these disruptive changes in the world, we see the converse of that of extraordinarily expensive drugs and extraordinarily expensive drug development. The other interesting curve here that I often talk about is this notion of genomic sequencing. And genomic sequencing, if you look at the price of that, that's coming down very, very, very quickly. Full genome analysis now, how much? What would you be willing to pay? 600, yeah. 800 if you want it in 24 hours. You could even, it's a full sequence though. You can get a partial sequence for almost nothing. 23andMe is $99 now, but you're not really getting a full genomic sequence. Here's the interesting thing. I think it's going to go to 0. I think it's going down so fast that it's going to be a Google dynamic. We'll give you a map for you to use in Google Maps or Waze, and you give us your data. Same thing with genomics. We'll give you a full sequence. It's free. It's underwritten by a company like Illumina or Human Longevity. So I think a lot of very interesting shifts are changing. And that exponential dynamic is a word that you'll hear time and time and time again. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but I just want to go through it. Yes, sir?
One question.
Yes?
What is your y-axis? What type of growth? Depending on what unit you pick there, you could have different discussions.
This was just the frequency of innovation. So I mean, the y-axis it really has an x-axis and a cumulative number of innovations. So it's total innovations. Like you had the printing press, right? And then kind of nothing happened for a long time. And then it's really that frequency, that rate of change. So that's kind of what's on that y-axis. So the idea of exponential change, and everybody is familiar with this exponential dynamic, right? Ray Kurzweil talks about it. There's exponential university, all this exponential mumbo jumbo. But basically, exponential change is it happens really, really fast. If I gave you a penny today, tomorrow I'll give you 2 cents, and then the next day I'll give you 4 cents. How long would it take you to be a millionaire? Anybody? Take a guess. 28 days, 26 days, in less than a month. You'll have $1 million. So when we see redoubling, when we see changes like that, it's the same thing with distance. 26 steps, 1 meter a step, or 26 exponential steps takes you around the world 26 times. And we're actually seeing changes, some game changes in here. So I think it's an important dynamic. It's a certain part of the lexicon of digital health where we talk about sort of the exponential changes or rapid changes that are intrinsically disruptive to a marketplace. And that's going to happen very, very frequently in the context of radiology, in the context of imaging. We'll see just really fundamental changes that become sort of dematerialized and demonetized. The prices are going to drop very, very quickly. So the good thing about exponential growth is it's kind of interesting. It's a fundamental market dynamic, but there are 2 areas that come up time and time again. This is the killer slide. This is the slide that you put in your back pocket that you tell management about. Because anybody who's ever done a digital health initiative or an accelerator, you ever try to build a little accelerator, one of these little kind of startups thing. I'm going to talk more about accelerators later, but what happens is if you really find fundamental and rapid changes in the world, and you compare it to traditional linear growth, and everybody is sort of judged by linear growth. I want 5% increase in sales year on year. But if you look at what happens in sometimes in exponential or rapid changes is you get to this period of disappointment. So 6 months into your initiative with your accelerator or your new initiative, the boss looks at you and says, well, you're worse off than if we did more traditional linear growth. So you have to prepare yourself for that notion of disappointment and manage expectations around it because rapid change, innovation, and innovational change often comes with that point of disappointment. Now the flip side to this is another interesting dynamic and it cuts both ways. If your supply side is in order, if you have enough samples to get into the sales force, to get delivered by the rep, and you go through a burst of growth, you're in a period of amazement. Everything is great, everything is happy. But conversely, and what I find almost more frequently is you create an app that is effective or really kicks in. You don't have capabilities to scale. You can't scale it, and what you end up with is this notion of chaos. So when we talk about exponential curves and exponential growth, it's interesting and it's important to recognize that you will fall below a traditional linear perspective, and you have to be prepared for that notion of chaos and amazement. So those are just some of the sort of 30,000-foot views that's happening in the world today. Now, we're here talking about healthcare and technology around the life science industry, but it's not happening there. In fact, I would argue that oftentimes life science is the laggard, not the leader here, because it's changes that are occurring around the world. And the classic examples that everybody knows about, and interestingly, is Uber in its demise. As you listen to what's going on in Uber and all sort of the trouble that's going on, has Uber become yesterday's model of innovation? It's been said that if it works, it's obsolete. So that's the rule of innovation today. If it works, it's obsolete. But if we think about the changes that are going on in the world, we talk about Uber. Uber is the biggest taxi company that owns no cars. Biggest taxi company that owns no cars. And the other example is Airbnb, I guess, is the classic. And that the biggest hotel chain owns no real estate. Think about it. I mean, the hotel business is basically a real estate model, buying properties and owning them. It's your portfolio of property. But now we're seeing things like Airbnb really fundamentally changing things. The notion of ownership might completely evolve. For example, why do we own a car full-time? I use my car, 10% of the time it's in the garage, and I'm paying for insurance full-time. But the notion of shared ownership or collective ownership may be an evolution to this kind of fundamental dynamic. It's moving across this continuum where technology, and this is a real picture, I just think it's very poignant because Abe Maslow, the psychologist, talked about human need and empowerment and that whole notion of home and food, water and shelter and empowerment. I really do believe that in today's world, we're seeing the notion of food, water, shelter. I don't know, what would be another word that would go in there? Tech is sort of a holding point. Data? Internet access? Cell phones, yeah. I mean, clearly that's where we are, where it's no longer an option. I'm going to go back to something I said early on. Remember I said athletic option, clinical imperative? Technology is becoming a social imperative. A social imperative. If you leave home and go to work and you forget your lunch, you're like, that's okay, I'll buy something. But if you leave home and you forget your phone, you turn around and come back. And you get it. You need it. It's an essential tool. So what I'm finding is that the emergence, the intrusion of technology in our lives is really kind of taking off, and it's becoming fundamental. So when we talk about aspects of human need, fundamental hierarchy, human hierarchy like Abe Maslow, I really do believe that technology fits into that continuum to the point where people are starting to talk about, is technology a human right? And again, tech is in quotes. Is data, is internet a human right? I'm not so sure I believe that, but that's kind of where the discussion is going. I want to talk a little bit about this convergence in human history, why I think that today is important. And it's an inflection point in the sense that it's a precipitous curve, it's a change, it's a game changer. And I think it begins kind of now, and I use this very, very specifically. It's not just this abstract notion that's occurring in the world, over the course of several years. I think we're really experiencing it now. And I want to go back 100 years. 100 years. And I think it's going to be interesting how we look at what happened in that part of the century. Anybody know what happened in the year 1900? You can say it. You know it. Nothing, right? Nothing. Nothing happened. Somebody was born, there was probably some little bit of an innovation, but really the 20th century functionally did not begin in the year 1900. But when you go into 1912, 1915, 1916, even particularly 1917, you found the emergence of things like World War I, the Russian Revolution, significant social strife. And that began to define the century. Similarly, innovation took foothold. Albert Einstein's special theory of relativity. Anybody know what the mass of an electron is? Just for fun? No? Okay. It's 9.1 times 10 to the minus 31st kilograms. But it became small data, 1.6 times 10 to the minus 19th coulombs. As insignificant and as irrelevant as that may feel, the ability to calculate, weigh, track an electron really gave birth to what is the new social currency today, is the electron. Can I charge my smartphone? Go to the airport and you'll see that. So we found that innovation became part of our reality around this point in this century, looking up and seeing astronomy, that electron. That didn't happen until about 1916 or 1917. And another thing began to take foothold. And I want you to pay careful attention to this. There was an emerging sense of wonder. That sense of wonder was that technology was our friend. that our ability to leverage things like indoor plumbing or a washing machine or a gas stove or even refrigeration began to be part of our lives. And that was a really interesting time. Now, I want you to think about standing out in a cornfield. We'll talk about Oklahoma a little bit. And looking up and seeing an airplane. Think about the emotion of seeing that airplane. Two things should happen. Two emotions should come to the forefront of your thinking as I understand this. The first is, wow, that's amazing. But that rickety plane lands in your cornfield, and the guy takes off his goggles and says, come on, let's go for a ride. What would you do? Anybody? Chances are you're not going to go. Most people would not go. Would you let your kids go? Would you, hey, go on, kids, go for a ride in the airplane? No. Your sense of wonder would be tempered by a sense of concern, a sense of fear. And that's a reality that came to us around 1916, 1917. And I want you to remember that because it's an important observation. Similarly, we began to see things like child labor laws, women's suffrage, the empowerment of the individual, that it no longer was about the sort of bureaucratic government system. So we see in terms of the Russian Revolution, but also the empowerment of the individual, that not only I, but as a collective society, we have power, we have authority. So this is where the century was, about 100 years ago. Now you know where I'm going, right? I hope. Let's go to the year 2000. My question is the same one as prior. What happened in the year 2000? Y2K didn't happen, right? Y2K didn't happen. There you go. Nothing happened in the year 2000, right? Let's face it, this thing, where's my smartphone? My smartphone is 10 years old, 2007. So I would argue that not a lot happened in the beginning of the century, but now as we look what's going on now, today, in our reality, we begin to see some interesting things. We see that same level of global strife, but look what we're adding to it. We're adding to it the notion of health. That the system is broken, not only from a perspective of the United States, which is a big issue, but globally. We're seeing an aging population, the inability to get care to people. Even though there are advances in wellness, health is part of that strife continuum that we saw 100 years ago. Innovation, I'm not going to even speak to because it's just amazing. Everywhere we look, we're seeing profound innovation, things like robotics and artificial intelligence and big data. How the electron went from this one tiny thing into this massive electrons called big data. But I want to talk about the sense of wonder because we're seeing now things like 3D printing, printing organs, tissue printing, holography. The first holographic phone call was just sent today. It was done in New Jersey. I saw the press release. The idea of self-driving cars, personalized drug therapy, the emergence of longevity, a real sort of understanding of the dimensionalization of longevity in the context of even things like transhuman reality, whatever that is. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So soon, a car will come to pick you up and take you to the airport, but it's going to be a driverless car. And I think this is, as the gentleman in the back alluded to, this is the same fundamental game-changing dynamic as the airplane. Remember, the airplane was a sense of wonder. Wow, this is amazing, I'm not getting into it. The same dynamic is occurring now. My first drive in a driverless car scared the hell out of me. It was just, you sit in it and it just drives. It was very, very frightening. And I think most people will have the same fundamental feeling that when they see that driverless car, that it's great, it's exciting, it's a truly sense of wonder, but I'm not going to get in it. Now, I want you to go ahead 10 years. Not 100 years, just 10. The same opportunity, we'll be back again for another meeting, and this time our drive to the airport will be in a driverless car, but you'll have the option of having me drive you in my Tesla, right, whatever. But you won't do it. Why? The human driver is too dangerous. 40,000 people are killed every year in driver cars, and we'll have the opportunity to leverage technology to make cars extraordinarily safe. So I think that's going to become exactly like that crazy wild airplane 100 years ago. And that the driverless car is here, the technology is currently available. People are using the more sophisticated models now to have semi-autonomous drivers. Those of you kind of watch what's going on with some of the Tesla models. It's here today. People are actually driving in driverless cars. And I believe that's going to be the wake-up call to the fundamental intrusion into our lives, because let's face it, America has a love affair with the car. America doesn't have a love affair with healthcare. In fact, they disdain healthcare. But they have a love affair with the car, and when that car changes into a new modality where you no longer drive it, or largely have the option not to drive it, or don't drive it because your insurance company mandates that you use autonomous drivers because you're paying $288 a year for car insurance as opposed to $2,800. So the imposition of a financial imperative might help you embrace a driverless car too. So I think that really is kind of the game changer that we're seeing in the world today. And then we're seeing this new social consciousness. And that social consciousness not only is about the empowerment of the individual, but things like Dave and I, Brian and I talk about all the time, the quantified self. The ability to quantify our lives, our data, personalized medicine. So that's another sort of interesting dynamic that's very, very similar to what happened 100 years ago. So that's why when I talk about today as really kind of an inflection point in human history, it's very similar to what happened 100 years ago. So I want to talk a little bit about digital health, some of the hot buttons, what I think defined the movement. And again, I want to talk very, very abstractly and not get too technical or too granular about some of these things. But what are the trends that define it? Interestingly, the future really is what it used to be. Many of us grew up with this idea of Dick Tracy and talking in your phone and all sorts of weird realities like the tricorder on Star Trek. But that's important because no one in this room grew up thinking about a 5 Tesla magnet for an MRI, right? As a kid, you never kind of got all jonesed and happy about a Tesla magnet or interesting compression circuit. But you did grow up with this kind of stuff. So digital health has a sort of psychopathology that resonates with us both sort of intellectually and viscerally. And I think that's kind of an interesting way of looking at why this resonates, particularly with medical students. Medical students grew up as digital natives. In other words, they always had a smartphone. It was part of their stuff. Now, you know how to tell if you're a dinosaur or not in the digital health world? Who wears a watch? If you wear a watch, you're a dinosaur. That's the test. Because ask a 16 or 17-year-old kid today, did they wear watches? Of course not. Well, they wear a watch. So you're seeing that sort of digital native dynamic infused into medical school today. And I've spent a lot of time talking with medical students, and I'm going to get just a little off track, but one of the reasons that medical students have a much more optimistic perspective about care today is because they recognize technology is really a very, very cool future. And they look at things like artificial intelligence and the ability to pick up their smartphone and ask, what's a differential diagnosis for abdominal pain in a 28-year-old woman? That you should get. That's not a question of reason. That's a list that exists now. But if you're in a hospital and you're a medical student and you're in grand rounds at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, and the attending asks the intern, or the intern asks the medical student, or the chief of staff asks the attending, and they take out their smartphone, what happens? You get in trouble. There's a real fundamental disconnect because there's a hierarchy, there's an intellectual hierarchy, and that's changing now. Medical students are really breaking that mold. So I think the fundamental change is when medical students, interns, get out of the program and start becoming rank and file physicians. When you see them as part of the attending staff, you'll see a change in the way they embrace technology. So it's really interesting because that technology was sort of made fun of or we fantasized is coming at us at the speed of life. But technology's always been around. We've always incorporated technology into our lives. This is a portable pacemaker. The first portable cardiac pacemaker done by Medtronic. I think the year was 1958 or 1959, probably before most of us were born. So technology is older than many of us, but it's advancing in ways that are so amazing and so swift in their change. This is the same Medtronic pacemaker today. It's a tiny little thing you put into the ventricular apex. It has no leads. You program it externally, and you can plant it using things like telemedicine, where a guy in sub-Saharan Africa might be involved in implanting this. We have a cardiologist in Boston watching it online. So it's come a long way. Technology is really emerging in ways that are extraordinary, and they're changing fundamental aspects of care. And some of it is just completely new, just completely crazy. Anybody want to guess what this thing is? This picture is 5 years old already. It's a kidney. It's a kidney. It's a kidney grown in a lab. It happens to be a rat kidney, but it's still a kidney. And this is technology that's now being developed where we can use a variety of cell cultures, decellularized tissue cultures, and regrow or reprogramming cells. So this is interesting because what's going to happen here is we're not going to become organ donors. A very difficult path when you think about it. If you look at your driver's license and whether or not you're a designated organ donor. Organ donation has been tricky. So if we stop becoming organ donors because we can grow our own organs, and this is a reality that's in the near future. It's a little off, but it's something that we should consider. What will become the new donation? I'm sorry? I didn't hear. Health? Maybe. Okay. I think what we're going to be is data donors. That's the new aspect that will help define our civilization. It's the integration of data and big data and high-end analytics. So again, you see that now. I mean, Google exists because you guys give them the data. You're a data donor. And that data donor really revolutionizes the way you engage geonavigation and traffic and Waze and all that kind of stuff. So I think we're going to move away from organ donation because we'll be able to repair and restore and grow organs and become data donors. Now, the interesting thing to me is that all these activity trackers have sort of gotten old. And they become sort of a pile of dust collectors, I find. And the interesting thing is when they first sort of emerge as a clinical tool beyond just simple steps, people said it's going to help you take your medicine. It's going to send you a reminder. It's going to shock you or vibrate or do something. So it's going to be the grand compliance tool. And everybody knows that whether you're hypertensive or depressed, how long you're on therapy? 2 months? And what's the average compliance on it for an SSRI today? It's not very long, 6 weeks or so for chronic therapy, even acute therapy. The interesting thing is that the compliance of the activity tracker seems to be no different than that of the pill. So here's this sort of panacea, and it's exactly the same. It's the same as a pill. You wear it for a few months, maybe a few weeks. You forget to charge it, and that vicious circle just happens, and you don't use it anymore. Why? Because it's an athletic option. It's not a clinical imperative. So I think it's important that as we evolve technology, that it has a higher order of clinical priority, both for patients and for clinicians. So as I said before, I think that it's kind of born on television. I think that this idea of Bones and Scotty and Star Trek and using it has this very interesting psychopathology that appeals to people. And what we're seeing is things like the tricorder are coming to market, are moving forward. I use this as an example as a device that I kind of have a love-hate relationship with. This is the Scanadu Scout, which was quite the rage a couple years ago. It's a small device that you put on your forehead. It does a single lead EKG. It tries to measure your blood pressure using something called a standing wave technique. It does skin galvanic response. It does a variety of things and then drops it off to your cell phone and does a little physical exam. So this idea of the tricorder is actually here today. This company is struggling. Their technology is probably not working, so I don't want to hold them up as an example of what's going on. But there's two interesting points I want to make here. The first is that they measure your blood pressure, and they use something called a standing wave technique. And the interesting thing is that The guy who founded the company, Walter de Brouwer, didn't know what he didn't know. Didn't know what he didn't know. In other words, if you ask a cardiologist or a clinician, how do you measure blood pressure? They say, well, you can either put an indwelling arterial catheter or you do the squeeze, right? The squeeze, that's how you take blood pressure, you squeeze. But the interesting thing about Xanadu, and what I find interesting about the digital health revolution, is that people who do not know are coming up with solutions. So this is questionable, this technology. They've kind of stumbled a little bit. They were doing a big trial with scripts and working with the FDA, and they've got into a little bit of trouble, but I applaud the effort. The interesting thing about this doctor who founded Xanadu, Walter de Brouwer, and his wife Samia, is that he was a doctor. But he was a social scientist. He wasn't an MD, wasn't even a physiologist, he was a social scientist. And what happened was his son was sitting on a window ledge and fell out the window and had a catastrophic brain injury. And this is what drove Walter to become a citizen scientist. And this is sort of a dynamic, the empowerment of the citizen scientist, that is also a very important trend. Remember we talked about the year 1917 and 2017 and the democratization of health, how there's this level of social empowerment. This is the example of that kind of social empowerment, where people want to own their data, where people want to take control of their lives, where they become the innovators and they do things that might question authority, that do things from their own perspective. But as Copernicus taught us, great ideas often start as blasphemies. So this idea of Xanadu and the Scout really is much more about the emergence of the role of the individual. And I think that we can learn so much when we talk to our patients and to our customers, that they really do have tremendous insights into the marketplace. I would argue that the smartest body out there is the collective intelligence of parents with sick kids. Smarter than the guys at Sloan, smarter than the people at Dana-Farber, smarter than the people down here over at MD Anderson. These mothers and fathers are driven by profound emotion, great cognitive skill and depth, and they often know more about a rare condition than the clinical authorities. They know the trials, they know their kids' bloods, they know the labs, they know how they're feeling, they know how they're acting. They have a collective intelligence that's extraordinarily powerful, and we can tap into that. That's part of that collective reality, I think, is a very important part of the digital health movement, the empowerment of the individual. So I sort of riff off on Xanadu a little bit because as a company, I think they're kind of in trouble, but as a concept, they're very sort of prototypical. And in the light of the Xanadus of the world, there's my favorite woman, Elizabeth Holmes, the first self-made billionaire in the United States who is currently worth zero. Zip, nada. And that was the Theranos debacle. I'm not exactly sure how to frame it up, but I think what we find in digital health is that there are disasters, there are opportunities, but they can kind of fall apart very, very quickly. And that is an interesting dynamic. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the context of freedom to fail and fail fast. By the way, does everybody know about Theranos? Theranos was the microtainer, the little blood thing that kind of blew up. So I want to go through a couple trends and some big ideas and just kind of walk you through some things about what defines digital health from my perspective. I think that small is clearly a characteristic of the industry. We're looking at nanoparticle-mediated mumbo-jumbo. Lots of things are getting extraordinarily small, and we're looking at the movie The Fantastic Voyage. Does anyone remember Fantastic Voyage, where they shrunk these guys and put them in, I think, through a tear duct or something? They got out through the tear duct, and they dissolved a clot in their little mini spaceship. We're actually seeing that now. We're seeing nanobots made out of bacteria, bacteriobots that have specific biological activity, and even these small robots that Ray Kurzweil talks about that will scavenge our body looking for disease. So it's defined by this thing that's small, but contrary to that, or in contrast to that, is this notion of computing power and the brilliance of AI, processing speeds, and memory storage. So we're seeing this kind of movement towards processing power being greater than all of human thought. This is the proverbial singularity that Ray Kurzweil talks about. I am a big believer in the emergence of this kind of really freaky smart stuff. Scares the hell out of me. But I study and I spend a lot of time looking at artificial intelligence. I have friends at places like DARPA, the government, and just trust me, the application of technology to cognition and mind and humanity is going to be very, very interesting. We're already sticking probes in people's brains and doing weird stuff now. I mean, even in the context of deep brain stimulation and Parkinson's disease, a company like Medtronic, they've been doing it for 20 years. So the use of neural lace and computer interfaces that Elon Musk just talked about is here, and it's going to leverage this. It's also meaningful, and I think what we're finding in technology now is a lot of times it's tech for tech. It's like, oh brother, I'm gonna get my genome measured or analyzed, but no one's gonna know what to do with the data, so it's meaningless. We're seeing the movement towards meaningful. I like this little sensor because what it does is it's implanted in situ after cancer therapy. So I have a tumor resected, and they put this little sensor and they close you up. And what it provides is real-time biochemical analysis of the surgical site. So instead of waiting 6 months and getting a PET scan or an MRI or looking for some visual proof of tumor, we can actually start measuring biochemical markers at the tumor site in real time. So we begin to look at chemotherapy or the ability to sort of act on these tumor sites as a mixing board where we can modulate things very, very unique to the nature of the patient. So this is that personalized therapy, the democratization of health. Now, if we can find that tumor site, if we can find that cancer cell earlier and earlier and earlier and earlier, we get to this place called stage 0 medicine. It's one of my favorite places. Daniel Kraft, who leads up Singularity, talks a lot about stage 0 medicine. But I want to explain the idea. First of all, we spend all our money on end-of-life care, right? We don't spend any money on prevention. Why? Well, number one, it's hard to validate. Number two, it's just nobody wants to exercise. I mean, come on. Did everybody eat their lettuce or their spinach? It's just no fun. So I think that prevention will be best served by technology. And I mean that in the sense that if we could find the first cancer cell in your body, think about that. I know it's a hypothetical, but guys at Google and Verily are doing this now. It's on their plate and they're working on it. They're looking at nanoparticles that could scavenge or at least just measure or monitor the occurrence of a cancer cell. If we can find and track the first cancer cell and kill it, granted I know that's not a very practical or even scientifically accurate concept, what did we do? What did we do? We cured the cancer, we killed the cancer at this very, very, very early stage, at stage 0. But think about it. What we did is we shared a border with prevention. We shared a border with prevention. So maybe the trick to getting to cancer prevention is by earlier and earlier and earlier and earlier disease detection. And if you can find the first cancer cell, you may have to be less vigilant in terms of exercise and wellness because we could nip it in the bud. Now, I don't want to put health clubs out of business, but I think that is a real reality in terms of what we can do. So that notion of stage 0 disease is real interesting. I'll give you another example of stage 0. This was published in Science by Eric Topol. Many of you probably know Eric. Wrote a great book. The book is called The Patient Will See You Now. The Patient Will See You Now. And he articulates a lot of the dynamics of digital health. So it's a great read. I recommend it. But here's an idea of what's going to happen in a few years from now. Your smartphone will go off, and it'll ring, and it'll say, hey, John, you're having a heart attack. But don't worry. Make an appointment with your cardiologist, and she'll take care of it in a week. Think about that dynamic. Any of you who have experienced chest pain or had a loved one who had an MI or have any clinical experience, when you see that person in the emergency room with their ST segments through the roof and they're ashy and cold and their pulse is thready, you know who the most nervous person in the emergency room is? It's the doctor. These patients are extraordinarily unstable. You know, a person who presents in the emergency room with an acute MI, it's problematic. But when we look at what's going on, the underlying pathophysiology is that we see that there's a platelet, there's an abnormality in the endothelial tissue, there's plaque. The plaque begins to crack. the crack reliefs markers like thromboxanes and endoperoxides. And this process is not an immediate event, it's a gradual event. And that if we can begin to track some of these gradual events, we can know that someone is in line for a heart attack in 2 or 3 or 6 days. So it's an interesting dynamic now, the way we're treating acute myocardial infarction, at least from an experimental perspective in Eric Topol's lab. It's an expensive proposition, but it does what I talked about earlier. It takes that shift from an athletic option to a clinical imperative. Let's go back to the early cancer detection. So we've got a mom, 38-year-old mom, status post, radical mastectomy. So we're going to say, we're going to give you an injection every 6 months of these nanoparticles, and you're going to wear a tracker, and the tracker is going to look for something odd. And if that tracker beeps, call me, and we'll take care of it at the earliest possible point in time. Similarly, if I've got a man who had an MI, he's got acute coronary syndrome, high-risk guy, if I give him this device and I say, listen, we're going to track you to make sure that that heart attack doesn't happen, but if something bad starts to emerge, the tracker's going to go off. Are they going to wear it, or are they going to let it become a dust collector? See, I think that's the fundamental change. Remember the Carl Malden ads for American Express? Some of you might remember it. Don't leave home without it. I carried that. Well, that's the feeling. Tell that mom that she left the house without her nanoparticle tracker and her cell phone, and she'll come back and get it. So these are some of the areas of development. They're a long way off, and they're also very pricey. And I just want you to think back of the movie Wall Street with Gordon Gekko. And remember, Gekko was walking on the beach, and he has this thing in his hand. It's called the brick, and it was a cell phone. And it was $10,000, and every minute was $5. In the same way, remember the first time you saw a flat screen? That $10,000 36-inch flat screen. Wow, I can't wait to get it. But that's the nature of technology. So yes, price is high, price is expensive, but I think to some degree, let the people with a lot of money share the failure. So it's not necessarily a problem that it's an expensive option right now, because I think technology will drive the price down, but it's in that milieu of expensive people. It's the Elon Musks of the world who kind of play around in this dynamic. So I think that that's important. And to kind of make this come full circle, right now this technology is being applied in the context of a pregnancy test for early detection of cancer. So it's no longer that expensive nanoparticle that you have to inject and track. It's just monitoring chemicals in your urine to look at the early development of particular cancer. So this is here today, great work being done at MIT. So that's kind of that clinical imperative now that I think is very, very, very exciting. You still with me? Are people kind of awake in here? I see them heads nodding, yes? Okay, good. Our world is small, our world is vast, our world is big, our world is augmented. The idea of artificial intelligence is a talk in of itself. I just want to tell you one thing about AI. Not only is it here, but the way I like to look at it is that it's better to talk about it flipped around the other way. Don't call it AI, call it IA. People tend to deal with it better. It's intelligence augmented. It's our intelligence augmented. It's me picking up my smartphone and asking what that differential diagnosis is for the 28-year-old woman with abdominal pain. So we're seeing that in clinical practice now, where we can augment cognition, and it's a very, very powerful tool. Ultimately, it will impinge upon the profession, particularly around the areas, let's say, radiology. I think radiology is the first big profession that's going to get almost completely replaced by artificial intelligence. We also augment our lives in the context of performance. So when we talk about digital health, we often talk about the paralyzed person who could walk. That's sort of a fundamental reality. But really augmented performance here is also the surgeon in the operating room who uses a harness who can sit more comfortably and do a long procedure without the stress of their lower back or legs. It's the factory worker who's using a harness or a type of exoskeleton to pick up a box and move it with less injury, with a better outcome. So performance across a variety of ways is really emerging as a big tool. Take a good look at this lady, all right? She's jubilant. We all talk a lot about artificial VR and AR today. Here's an opportunity. Here's a woman who looked at something, and I don't know, I think it was like a Ferris wheel or a roller coaster. And the one thing I want you to take away with the emergence of VR is that there's a grand sense of empathy. Because this woman not only is getting a thrill about seeing the Eiffel Tower, but she can also have the ability to see what it's like for her husband who has wet macular degeneration. So you can put that context, his field of vision, which is grossly impaired, and let her see it. Let her try to walk with wet macular degeneration. Or conversely, maybe you want to show someone who has a movement disorder, and let that spouse or let that caregiver or even that clinician put that dynamic on and live in that world, take steps in their moccasin, so to speak. And we're also augmenting therapy with things like VR and AR. We're looking at people who have post-traumatic stress disorder, people who are afraid to fly, but we can put them in this artificial environment and let them kind of relive it and reprogram their brain. So there's great success, big, exciting success at DARPA on this, but also practical local experience with a lot of people who are looking at things like simple pain control, end-of-life care using virtual reality. So it's a big, important area. It's kind of this mixed reality is the fourth fundamental advance. I want to throw you in, this is a book by Robert Scoble, but basically what we're seeing is the interface advances over the years. There have been fundamentally four. The first was the keyboard. It allowed you to type into the computer. The second one was the mouse, that GUI interface that Steve Jobs stole from Xerox. The third was touch. Think how amazing touch. My son doesn't even understand touch. I mean, every computer he looks at, he goes and touches the screen. There is everything, it's touch screen, but touch was the third. And that mixed reality or virtual reality where we become part and parcel of that dynamic is the fourth. So we're actually seeing the four fundamental changes in terms of technology and how that's going to impact our lives. Now, it's also extraordinarily personal. This is a slide that usually I talk about a half hour or an hour, but it's this notion of genomic analysis, and we often talk about that as sort of the benchmark for understanding ourselves, genomic analysis. But we live in a world that is extraordinarily more complex. We live in an external world where we have an exposome. We are exposed to a variety of things. Chemicals that make us sick, chemicals that help us grow, chemicals that do all sorts of things, even technology. A sidebar to this discussion is the next water pollution or the next air pollution information? Is information the next toxin? Because there's so much coming on. But there's this idea of the microbiome, our gut, the proteome, transcriptome, all sorts of things. So we really live in this world of multi-omics. And I think this is a very important consideration. And when we talk about personalized therapy, it's not just personalized in the context of our genome. It's much more broader and richer than that. I think that data is the big news. We all talk about big data, and we use it as as sort of a catchphrase, you know. Put the word paradigm in your presentation, all those marketing. Big data is the marketing word now. We'll do a big data analysis, figure it out. I think that it is really a big deal. Data is coming at us in ways that are just, whether it be velocity, whether it be data volume, and these data are even old, or variety, sources. What data is the third fundamental window into humanity, I believe. That data is going to unlock secrets of connectivity that will advance human evolution. The first window into humanity was the telescope. And Copernicus said, wow, there's this grand world beyond this little human construct. In fact, maybe the way the planets rotate is quite different. And of course, what Copernicus taught us is great ideas are often considered blasphemies. But that was the first window into changing this broad perspective. The second one was kind of the opposite. It was the microscope. It allowed us to look deeply into a whole new reality and find this new world. I believe that big data in the context of extraordinary processing speeds, memory storage, and artificial intelligence will show us a level of connectivity that will be absolutely amazing. So that is something that I think is really a defining element in our world today. The interesting thing is it's all going to go away. is that our smartphones will go away, sensors will go away, they may end up living in your hand and chips and things like that. I'm probably going to get one because I think it'd be cool for me to raise my hand and say I have a chip. I can't tell my wife because she'll yell at me, but I think it might be kind of fun. It's actually here. The idea is all going to kind of go away and become much more passive data acquisition. And when I was at the Consumer Electronics Show, I walked around the floor, and my most interesting discussion was not with the tech companies and not with the pharma and the life science companies. It was with Lowe's, with a big box company. And the people at Lowe's said, wow, man, we think this is great. We want to put sensors in carpets so that when you walk, we can measure your footsteps. Or when your mom falls, we can tell you that she's lying on the floor or that her body temperature is colder than it should be. Or there's a gait abnormality, that someone is walking with a little bit of a tremor. They said, we want to own the bathroom. Kohler. Because the bathroom is the greatest laboratory in your house. They want to build a mirror that when you look in that mirror, it's going to scan your EKG looking for atrial fibrillation. They want to have a toothbrush when you brush your teeth, it's going to look for unusual bacteria or flora that might be associated with coronary artery disease. They want to own your toilet because that's where all the data is. So this was the kind of emergence of these trackers going to something that is passive. And I found that to be a really, really interesting discussion because we can put sensors in chairs, and the chair can interface with your phone, and the chair will tell you you're sitting too long, or you're not moving, or your posture is not good. So I think the passive acquisition of data is really, really interesting. Another term, another area of the digital health movement is this notion of the collaboratory. We live in a world of collaboration, and our connectivity through the net is profound and just goes all the way around the world. But we're looking at unusual combinations. People like Nestle, who want to quantify nutrition, are partnering with a company like Samsung, who's going to do the tech to kind of build this. So you're seeing unusual bedfellows, and I think that's a really, really interesting lesson to be learned, that when we look at innovation, whether it be in the context of our companies, life science companies, or things we're doing, bring in a guy named Walter de Brouwer, who's a social scientist, who's going to approach a problem in a new and an interesting way. So these collaborations are really defining. Another famous collaboration now, which is kind of languishing a little bit, is the notion of the Google contact lens that measures blood sugar. It's been very popular for a few years. That was a combination between Google and Novartis, or Alcon, I guess. So I want to go through this real quick, and I'm going to wrap it up because I know I'm sure you're all very, very tired. But there are a few devices that I like, and I like them for very interesting reasons. Number one, how many people here know about the AliveCor EKG machine, the smartphone EKG machine? Not too many, a couple. This is a device where you use your smartphone and it takes your EKG. It's real simple, it's clinically validated, it stores it, you send it off to your cardiologist or your doctor. So if you have palpitations or you're being evaluated for something, it's a great tool. It's being applied to the Apple Watch now, and it's passively tracking heart rate to look for a condition called atrial fibrillation. What I like about this is it's real, it's validated, it works, it's great science. It was invented by a physician scientist whose name is Dave Albert. And it's a real interesting tool because it looks for variation in heart rate. Very, very simple. It's musical. If you ever heard what your heart rate sounds like, it sounds like this. Zzz, and when you go to sleep, it goes zzz. When you wake up in the morning, it goes zzz. And it's very musical, and you can use an algorithm to track that. Really simple. But when you have atrial fibrillation, it sounds like drrrr. It sounds very ugly. And you can track it. And atrial fibrillation is the leading cause of stroke and death. And the strokes tend to be catastrophic because they're embolic strokes. So AliveCor is a great device. It's actually sort of one of the proving points, I believe, of digital health. I'm very impressed with this company, and they're doing a lot of work. I cite MD Live as a telemedicine company because I think telemedicine is a game changer. The interesting thing about telemedicine is that we use telemedicine where we don't need it. We try to push it into Houston and Dallas, where we already have a fairly well-developed clinical infrastructure. I think it should go to sub-Saharan Africa. I think it should be used to help prenatal therapy, and women understand they should take folic acid. So the interesting thing about telemedicine, and I think it really is a fundamental game changer, because it's going to be used not only as a last-ditch modality, because when you think about telemedicine now, it's the mom in the middle of the night, who doesn't want to go to the emergency room, who can't get in touch with a doctor, who kind of defaults to telemedicine. I think it's completely the other way around. It's your first line of defense. And I think when we start changing that around, we'll see basic changes. Now, it's not only telemedicine, it's telepsychiatry. Think about how unobtrusive it is to have someone who's being managed for depression to call their therapist up on the phone and have a session. Think about an intern calling a doctor or a fellow calling an attending to look at a patient in the context of tele-ICU consultation. So the whole aspect of MD Live, or as I use MD Live as an example, I think is important. We're seeing a lot of changes in telemedicine. The proving ground of telemedicine may not be in Dallas. You know, it might be in Zimbabwe to a certain degree because the need is so great there. And fundamental changes of access to caregivers could be extraordinarily important. This is a really cool thermometer. It's nothing new. It's boring, right? It's just a simple old digital thermometer. Everybody with kids has a digital thermometer. Probably have two. The interesting thing about this Kinza device is that it takes the data, pushes it up to the cloud. It depersonalizes the data, pushes up into a cloud, and makes a weather map of the sickness. So just as we can see a weather map of a storm coming, we can do the same thing using temperature, body temperature. So you can do it as a city, you can do it as a state, you can do it as a country, or you can do it as a school district. If all the moms got together, all the parents got together, you can use this as a tool. This is what I think the advantage of big data will be. Nothing new about this device as a temperature, as a thermometer, but using big data analytics to push the data up as a cloud, using body temperature is real interesting. Google tried to do this with flu, but they realized that they looked for words like, you know, I feel funky, and they weren't sure if that meant I wanted to dance or if I was sick. So natural language is a real problem, and there are a lot of advantages with that. But Kinza is interesting because of the use of a heat map, because of the use of big data that kind of makes it interesting. I love this ad because this is an otoscope. Now, an otoscope is the ear, look, or inner thing, which is the domain of the doctor, right? It's the domain of the pediatrician. Here's a mom using it. Here's a mom who's looking at her kid's ear, sending a picture to the doctor, and this is the classic example of the transfer of control in medicine that we're seeing today. Back in the old day, it was all about control. You went to the doctor gave you a piece of paper, you took that to the pharmacist, and that was it. It was one-way communication. Same thing with big pharma. They had a big sales force, they had viz aides, they went to the doc, they told the doc to prescribe Lipitor, they gave him a lot of examples, they gave him big dinner meetings, you know, and that's how it worked. Today, it's a collaborative experience. And that collaborative experience is personified by this kind of a dynamic. What did this woman just do here? She recreated something that is fundamental and basic to us all. It's the house call. She created an electronic house call. An electronic house call. So how cool is that? And she uses equipment that's cheap, that's readily available, her smartphone. So the reason I'm showing you this is it's not because Cellscope is a particularly innovative company. I think what the dynamic is reinventing that house call. And it's empowering the mom to do something that no one ever thought a mom would do, use an otoscope to visualize the eardrum. Not the easiest thing in the world to do, by the way. So I want to wrap it up and just go through a couple things real quickly here. We can get these slides to you, but I think in today's world of collaboration, if you're a company working on digital health or innovations around apps or technology, it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of formula, and I work with clients all around the world, and they always want to say, well, what do we need? We need the accelerator. Okay, good, check. We need the team leader, check, and they go through this whole thing, but what really is, it's a mixing board of innovations, and you really have to fine-tune that or modulate that to the needs of your company. And I'm going to go through this very, very quickly. These 15 points come out of a book called The Decoded Company by Liram Siegel, and it talks about how companies can optimize the engagement. So I'm going to go very fast because I know you guys are getting tired. But really the linchpins, the 15 parameters are collaboration. Collaboration is really the touchstone to this. Diversity, various sources of thinkers. Remember Walter de Brouwer, a social scientist, people who do not know what they do not know. The idea of openness, there is no right or wrong idea. It's very, very powerful. The sense of community, that they have a shared purpose to help change the world. John Scully talks about this a lot. He talks about the noble cause, the noble purpose, the noble pursuit. The reason people are doing things in digital health is not because it's going to make them rich, because it's the right thing to do. There's a sense of nobility. That notion of the idea is supreme, The meritocracy is a very, very powerful one. The notion of activism, that we can change the world, that we are empowered to do things that no one else has done before. And that leads us to a deep sense of meaning, that this gives us meaning in life. Think of all the physicians today who are 40 and 50 years old who have lost that sense of meaning. They don't have that sense that what they're doing is really caring for patients. They're instilling lab data into this. The idea of structure, and structure is very important. Don't think that you just kind of build it and they will come. You have to have this sense of, this is the way we do it. We want 5 ideas in 3 weeks. Structure. Now, the exact timing and how you do it is tricky. It varies from different companies. But structure is powerful, and so is serendipity. We know that you never know where the idea comes from or how we're going to interpret it. Lack of knowledge, ignorance is a powerful thing. Build a team together of smart people who may not understand the nuances of diabetes, but they may bring an idea to the table that's very, very unusual. That notion of fail fast and experimentation is very powerful. By the way, these 3 slides are usually like an hour or 2 talk. Speed, do it, prototype, move in, change, fail fast. Okay? Trust is important, that good faith, that shared path to innovation, and the sense of urgency. That you've got to move on it, think about the idea, and explore it, move on it, and fail fast. So urgency is also a very, very important aspect of how you kind of build the accelerator today. So I want to end with this thought. The next 100 years, we talked a lot about 100 years ago and today, this 100-year is a real important point. And Ray Kurzweil said that the next 100 years will bring with it innovation that eclipses the last 20,000 years of human history. 20,000 years of human history. And that next 100 years is not an abstract notion. Think about this. A girl born today has a 1 in 3 chance of living to 100. A 1 in 3 chance of living to 100. It's absolutely amazing. So that next 100 years is our century. It's our century. And it's been said that the first person to live to 150 is alive today. And he or she very well may be in the room tonight. So with that, thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, John.